Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, the host of the Four Boxes Diner. For those of you new to this channel, I'm a constitutional attorney, a member of the Supreme Court Bar, and in 2021, I am proud to say that a federal judge, Roger Benitez, quoted me when he declared California's assault weapons ban to be unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. And if you love the Second Amendment and want to protect it, please hit the subscribe button to help us spread our message and our information here on YouTube. Now, this is a very important episode because I want to break down the phrase gun violence, sort of statistically in a way, so you can explain to your friends why it is a BS propaganda term. The anti-gun lobby likes to say things like, oh, we have a gun violence epidemic in America today because of something like 106 people a day are killed with guns. Killed with guns is what they say. And they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes by comparing apples and oranges to try to deceive you and other Americans, as I see it, into giving up your right to own and carry firearms. And I want to explain how this breaks down so you don't get duped by what the anti-gunners are doing with the phrase gun violence. We know that anti-gunners hate guns, and they hate the idea of you and I owning or carrying guns for self-defense. So to try to get politicians to pass gun control laws punishing ordinary Americans who just want to have guns for lawful self-defense, the anti-gunners use propaganda strategies to try to persuade us that people die in America every day because we have a Second Amendment that allows Americans to have firearms. In reality, the so-called gun violence that they identify, though, does not prove their case because the so-called gun violence has nothing whatsoever to do with ordinary law-abiding Americans exercising their Second Amendment rights. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why that's the case, okay? 3 critical facts I want you to understand. Because if you understand these 3 facts about the gun violence statistic of 106 people a day dying and gun-related deaths, you'll understand exactly how the anti-gunners are trying to pull the wool over our eyes. Okay, first, I want you to think about the concept of gun violence as a pie. Picture a pie that has a lot of data in it, okay? And that pie is going to be sliced up as I explained, so you can see just how small a number we're really talking about here when it comes to gun violence that most of us would be worried about in terms of, criminals killing law-abiding innocent Americans on the streets of our country. Okay, first, when the anti-gunners run around claiming that there is a quote-unquote gun violence epidemic in America, it's BS. And the reason why it is because the anti-gunners deceptively count suicides by firearms as a huge part of the so-called gun violence epidemic. Specifically, 60%, that's 60%, 60% of that pie I'm talking about involving gun violence statistics, 60% of that pie, maybe even more, involves suicides, all right? And the second thing I want you to understand is that the overwhelming majority of the gun-related crimes involving that other 40% of the pie involve illegal weapons by people that aren't legally allowed to possess them in the first place because they're felons. Third, most homicides and non-fatal shootings are committed by individuals with criminal records who not only are ineligible to possess firearms, but guess what? You're going to find, and I'm going to give you these statistics that you can take home with you, that you can use, and I'm going to give you the citations so you can use them too. Most of the criminals, when they're shooting other people, are shooting, ready for this, other criminals. These are gang-related violence or drug-related violence. And I'm going to give you the data from credible sources so you can use it going forward. First, when the anti-gunners run around claiming that there is a gun violence epidemic in America, the reality is that 60% of the people that are in that category of gun violence every day are killed by their own hand. They commit suicide. Now, of course, I would say every suicide, by and large, is a family or personal tragedy. But it makes no sense to blame so-called gun violence for suicides. Because remember, there are many countries that have no private ownership of guns, like Japan, that have far higher suicide rates than the United States. My second point is this. Then what about the other 40% of so-called gun violence, right? 60% of the gun violence is suicides. What about the other 40%? Let's break that down specifically. That's very important to do this because most people talk about suicides, but not that many people break down the 40% the way I'm going to try to do it for you right here and right now. The overwhelming majority of gun-related crimes in the United States are committed by, ready, with illegal weapons, which means that these are crimes committed by people such as felons who cannot legally possess firearms under 18 U.S.C. 922 of the federal code. Okay, now by and large, even anti-gun, big city mayors admit this is the fact, that gun crimes are committed by people who aren't even allowed to touch them in the first place. Okay? New York City Mayor Eric Adams recently released something called the Blueprint to End Gun Violence. Okay? This report says, quote, over the past several years, a small population of individuals has driven a massive increase in violence in our city. So Mayor Adams acknowledges it's just a handful of people really that are doing the bad stuff. We know this, it's the criminals. Now the third thing about gun violence I want you to understand, and this is very important, very few people talk about this, but I want you to be able to talk about this because the goal of this channel is to make you smarter than all the other people on this topic. That's my goal, okay? The point is this, is the third point. The vast majority of gun-related crimes in the United States consist of criminals shooting other criminals, okay? Law-abiding citizens are generally not involved. That does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. You do get innocent people killed by bad people. That 1,000% happens. But most of the day-to-day gun crimes in America are done by criminals hurting or shooting other criminals, either in drug deals that have gone bad or gang-related crimes, okay? And I'm going to give you the data here because a lot of this data is set forth in a very powerful amicus curiae brief submitted on behalf of law enforcement organizations and gun right organizations to the United States Supreme Court in the Nyserpa versus Bruin case. In that brief, which again I'm going to link to below, demonstrates my point, okay? That brief explains that the evidence and law enforcement experience confirm that most violent crimes are committed by repeat offenders whose criminal records generally render them ineligible to possess firearms. Felons, domestic abusers, for example, cannot legally possess or purchase firearms under the law. That's what the brief explains, and it's true. But violent criminals don't obey the law, and they don't get licenses, they don't do background checks, they don't buy their guns in the normal process. We know this because they're criminals, okay? Now let's talk about some of the statistics that prove my point, that a lot of this violence, a tremendous amount of this violence outside of the suicides is criminal on criminal violence, okay? This brief pointed out that in 2006, an analysis of 3 years of homicide data by the New York Times, lefty paper, revealed that more than 90% of the killers in New York City, that's 90% of the killers in New York City had criminal records, as did, ready, more than half of those people killed by the criminals, right? Half of the people killed by the criminals were criminals themselves. That doesn't mean that they should have been killed. It's just the reality of what's going on the streets, which is a lot of this is, gang-related and drug-related and criminal crime, okay? An NYPD, that's the New York Police Department report, showed similar results for the year 2012, the last year for which such a study was produced. In that year, 97% of homicide suspects had at least a prior arrest. 7 out of 10 homicide victims also had prior arrests. Not that this data showed the same. Now, by the way, this data showed basically the same exact pattern in Baltimore, Maryland. Because in Baltimore, Maryland, police for 2015, where they did the data, they did the report, they did the research, in 2015 in Baltimore, Maryland showed that of all the homicide suspects, guess what? 76.5% had prior criminal records. And again, those suspects averaged, ready for this? Average? 9 arrests apiece. And data released by the Baltimore Police for 2019, that revealed that 81.4% of all homicide suspects had prior records as well, as did 81.9% of the homicide victims. Isn't that interesting? That in Baltimore in 2019, 81% of the homicide suspects had criminal records, and 81.9% of the homicide victims also had criminal records as well. Again, I'll put the link to this information below. Now, again, the anti-gunners want you to think that guns are the problem. But of course, the real problem, if you look at the pie of gun violence, is 60% is suicides. And of the rest of the 40%, the vast majority of that is either people that are not allowed to have guns, using guns illegally, or criminal shooting criminal in gang deaths or whatever it is among criminals doing criminal things. So let's wrap up. How does it make sense to lump together unrelated phenomena like suicides, gang deaths, accidents, and mass shootings and label all the so-called gun violence? It makes no sense at all. But that's not the purpose of what the anti-gunners are doing. They want to lump as many people dying at the hands of guns, if you will, together to try to create the so-called gun violence epidemic, which in reality is simply not there. And to the extent there is any gun-related problem in America, it is not by law-abiding Americans who simply want to exercise their fundamental Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms for self-defense in this great country. That's not the problem. Okay, well, I hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. And again, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and we'll see you next time here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.